The rumble of an old pickup truck jolted me out of my daydreams that quiet evening. I was standing at the kitchen sink in our suburban Ohio home, hands wrist-deep in soapy water, when the noise hit, like a punch to the chest. I peered out the window, and there it was. A beat-up black truck, paint chipped and rusty, pulling up to the curb. A guy stepped out, mid-20s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and dark hair falling into his eyes. My husband's nephew. I'd almost forgotten he was coming to stay with us. That moment, watching him stride toward the house, something in me shifted, like the air before a storm. I've always been good at routine. Living out here in the sticks, surrounded by sprawling lawns and nosy neighbors, my days had a rhythm. Coffee at dawn, dinner on the table by 6, maybe a glass of wine on the back porch if the weather held. My husband, a solid guy who runs a construction crew, kept our life steady. He'd bring me coffee from that little joint on Route 7 every Saturday, fix the leaky faucet without me asking. It was comfortable, like a well-worn pair of boots. But sometimes, scrubbing pans or folding laundry, I'd catch myself wondering if this was all there was. Stability so thick it felt like quicksand. He told me about his nephew over breakfast a few days back. "Kid's in a rough spot," he'd said, sipping his coffee. "Quit his job up in Michigan. Needs a place to crash till he figures things out." I'd nodded, half listening, figuring it'd be no big deal. But when that truck rolled up, I wasn't so sure. The nephew walked in, and my husband greeted him with a big ol' handshake, the kind that says family matters. Me? I just stood there, drying my hands on a dish towel, trying to size him up. He gave me a quick nod, his eyes sharp and dark, like he was clocking every detail of the room, including me. We sat down to dinner that night, the three of us around our oak table. My husband dug into his meatloaf, asking the nephew about his plans, his old gig. The kid kept it short, tossing out one-liners like, "Construction wasn't my vibe, man." I chimed in with a couple questions. Where'd he last work? What's next? Trying to play the good hostess. But every time he looked my way, those eyes hit me like a spotlight. Not rude, just intense. After dinner, I cleared the plates while he grabbed a water from the fridge and headed upstairs to the guest room. I told myself it was nothing, just a guy passing through. But lying in bed that night, my husband snoring beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had cracked open. Next morning, I was up early, brewing coffee in the quiet. The house felt still, almost too still, till I heard footsteps. He came downstairs in running gear, grabbed an apple from the bowl, and slipped out the back door. I watched him through the window, jogging past the trees, all lean muscle and purpose. When he came back, sweaty and breathing hard, I was sitting with my mug. He nodded again, same quick flick of the eyes, and I noticed the way sweat clung to his neck. "Morning," he muttered, voice low. "Hey," I said back, keeping it cool. But inside, my pulse was doing double time, and I didn't know why. Here's the thing. I'm not some bored housewife looking for trouble. I've got a good life, a solid guy who'd move mountains for me. But that morning, watching him disappear upstairs, I started wondering, what happens when someone new walks into your world and suddenly, good feels like not enough? Was I crazy to even think it? Maybe. But that was the first spark, the one that'd burn everything down. The days after he moved in felt like walking on a tightrope. I'd gotten so used to the quiet in our Ohio house, nothing but the hum of the fridge or the occasional lawnmower buzzing down the street. But now, with my husband's nephew around, that stillness turned edgy, like the calm before a twister. He settled in quick, falling into a routine that brushed up against mine. Mornings, he'd be out running, his sneakers slapping the pavement past our backyard. Afternoons, he'd tinker in the garage with my husband's old Ford, the clank of tools echoing through the open door. I'd catch glimpses of him, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands smudged with grease, and tell myself it was no big deal. Just a guy crashing with us, except it didn't feel that simple. I kept busy to dodge the weird vibe. I'd whip up pancakes for breakfast, sort through junk mail, or water the marigolds on the porch. Anything to keep my hands moving and my head clear. But he had this way of showing up right when I thought I'd shaken it off. One morning, I was at the sink, rinsing out the coffee pot after my husband left for work. The house was dead quiet till I heard the floor creak. He walked in, fresh from a shower, jeans hanging low, hair still damp. He grabbed a glass, filled it from the tap, and leaned against the counter a couple feet away. I kept scrubbing, but my hands fumbled, soap suds splashing onto my shirt. His stare wasn't loud, just steady, like he was figuring me out. "You always up this early?" he asked, voice gravelly. "Yeah, habit," I shot back, keeping it light. He nodded, sipped his water, and left. But that moment stuck with me, like a splinter I couldn't pull out. A few days later, I needed air, bad. This tension was chewing me up, so I grabbed my keys and headed to the park a few miles out. It's this woodsy spot with trails that wind through pines, the kind of place where you can breathe and think straight. I parked by the entrance, laced up my sneakers, and hit the path, letting the crunch of gravel settle my nerves. About 2 miles in, I spotted him. He was jogging toward me in a dark hoodie, sweat beading on his forehead. He slowed down when he saw me, and we ended up at this little bridge over a creek, water gurgling below. "Didn't know you were a runner," he said, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Sometimes," I replied, shrugging it off. We started walking together, him matching my pace, the silence stretching out till he broke it, talking about how he loved the trails at dawn. I nodded, threw in a comment about the fresh air, but his voice, low, kinda rough, kept pulling me in. We stopped by a bench near the water. He leaned on the bridge railing, staring at the creek, and I stood close enough to feel the heat off him, but far enough to pretend I didn't notice. Then he turned, and his eyes locked on mine, not pushy, just deep, like he saw something I wasn't saying. My stomach flipped. I stepped back, mumbling about heading home, but he moved closer, his hand brushing mine for a split second. It wasn't much, but it lit me up like a live wire. Some guy walking his dog crunched by on the trail, and we both pulled away fast, like kids caught sneaking cookies. We headed back to the parking lot without another word, my heart pounding the whole way. Driving home, I kept asking myself what the hell was going on. I'm not some reckless gal chasing thrills. I've got a good man, a steady life. But that walk, that touch, it woke something up I'd buried deep. Was it wrong to feel alive for once? Maybe. Or maybe it's just human to wonder what you're missing when someone shakes your world up. That spark from the park didn't flicker out. It grew into something I couldn't ignore, like a brush fire creeping closer every day. I'd spent years building this quiet life in our Ohio suburb, where the biggest drama was the neighbor's dog digging up my tulips. But now, with my husband's nephew around, every room felt charged, like static before a storm. I tried to keep my distance, sticking to my routine. Coffee at sunrise, dishes by noon, maybe a rerun of Fixer Upper if I needed a break. But he had this knack for showing up, casual as anything, and turning my steady ground into quicksand. One morning, my husband was off meeting some big-shot client, leaving the house empty except for me and this restless feeling I couldn't shake. I decided to tackle the basement, figuring sorting through old boxes might burn off the jitters. I was knee-deep in Christmas decorations and faded photo albums when I heard footsteps on the stairs. He came down, a mug of tea steaming in his hand, and leaned against the wall, watching me wrestle with a tangle of lights. I kept my focus on the task, but my skin prickled under his gaze. "Need a hand?" he asked, voice low and easy. "Sure," I said, too quick to play it cool. He set the mug down, grabbed a box, and started pulling out old camping gear. Our hands brushed when he passed me a lantern. Nothing major, just a graze, but it hit me like a jolt. I froze, heat creeping up my neck. He didn't pull back right away, and neither did I. Then I bolted upright, muttering about checking the dryer upstairs, and hightailed it out of there. But I knew he'd seen my flinch, and that made it worse. A couple days later, he threw me another curveball. My husband was home, hunched over his laptop, when the nephew piped up about needing tools for the garage. Something about fixing up that rusty truck of his. "Hey, why don't you go with her?" my husband said, barely looking up from his screen. "She's got an eye for quality." I forced a laugh, but my stomach did a flip. Next thing I knew, we were in his pickup, rolling toward the hardware store on Route 12. The ride was quiet, just the rumble of the engine and some country station crackling through the speakers. I stared out the window at the blur of cornfields, but I could feel him. Every shift of his hands on the wheel, every glance he snuck my way. At the store, he wandered the aisles, picking up screws and a hammer, asking my take on a wrench set. "This one any good?" he said, holding it out. I nodded, reaching for it, and his fingers slid against mine. Soft, deliberate. My breath hitched, but I played it off, stepping back to scan the paint cans. He followed, close enough that I smelled the faint tang of his sweat, and my head spun. Back in the truck, the silence got heavier. I gripped the door handle, heart thumping like I'd run a mile. He kept his eyes on the road, but I caught him looking, calm, steady, like he knew something I didn't. We pulled into the driveway, and I bolted inside, claiming I needed to start dinner. That night, lying next to my husband's steady snores, I couldn't stop replaying it, his touch, that look. Guilt gnawed at me, but so did this itch I hadn't felt in years. Next morning, I found a note slipped under the bedroom door. "You feel it too, don't you?" Scribbled on a torn scrap, it hit me like a brick. I stashed it in my nightstand, but it burned a hole in my thoughts all day. I kept asking myself, am I nuts for letting this get to me? I've got a solid guy, a life most folks would kill for. But there's this pull, this whisper that maybe I've been sleepwalking through it all. Right or wrong, it's real. And that's the kicker. The air in our Ohio house turned thick, like humidity before a downpour, and I couldn't dodge it anymore. That note, "You feel it too, don't you?" sat in my nightstand like a loaded gun, and every creak of the floorboards felt like it was closing in. My husband's nephew had flipped my world upside down without even trying, and I was scrambling to keep my footing. I stuck to the kitchen that evening, peeling potatoes for a stew while my husband was out meeting his crew. The back door swung open, and there he was, grabbing a knife to help. We worked side by side, the chop of blades against cutting boards syncing up, but the space between us buzzed. Our hands brushed passing the salt. Quick, accidental, and my chest tightened. Then it happened. I turned, he stepped in, and for a heartbeat we froze, so close it felt like a reflex we couldn't stop. The doorbell snapped us apart, sharp as a thunderclap. My husband was back early. I smoothed my hair, splashed water on my face, and answered the door, praying my voice didn't shake. The nephew slipped upstairs, and my husband strolled in, oblivious, sniffing the air. "Smells good," he said, dropping his keys. I nodded, forcing a smile, but my pulse was a jackhammer. Next day, it all unraveled. I'd left that damn note in my nightstand, figuring it was safe. But my husband, rummaging for his glasses, found it. He walked into the kitchen, holding it up, his face hard as stone. "What's this?" he asked, voice flat. I fumbled, heat rushing to my cheeks. "Just some old thing I found," I said, and my voice cracked, raw with nerves I couldn't hide. He stared at me, eyes narrowing, then set it on the counter and walked out. No yelling, no fight, just silence, colder than Lake Erie in January. I knew he didn't buy it, and that cut deeper than any argument. The trust we'd built, that steady thing I'd leaned on, cracked right there. That night, I couldn't take it. I found the nephew on the back porch, stars popping out over the yard. I told him he had to go, firm, no room for debate. He looked at me, shadows playing across his face, and nodded slow, like he'd seen it coming. "If that's what you need," he said, quiet. Next morning, I watched his pickup peel out, dust kicking up on the road. My husband barely looked at me over breakfast, stirring his coffee too long. The house felt hollow like it had lost its pulse. I kept busy, scrubbed the stove, yanked weeds from the garden, but my head wouldn't quit. Was I the bad guy here? I'd pushed him out to save what I had, but it didn't feel saved. It felt broken in a way I couldn't fix. A week later, I was folding laundry when I found it. A tiny wooden bird tucked in my sweater pocket. No note, no explanation. Just this little carved thing, smooth and warm in my hand. I sank onto the bed, turning it over, and it hit me. He'd left it as a goodbye, a piece of himself I hadn't expected. Tears stung my eyes, but not just from guilt. It was beautiful, rough around the edges, but real. I slipped it into my jewelry box, out of sight, and stood up, wiping my face. Downstairs, my husband laughed at some dumb TV ad, and I froze. That sound, his laugh, hadn't changed. He was still here, still him. I walked to the window, staring out at the empty road, and realized something wild. I'd lost the nephew, yeah, but I hadn't lost everything. That bird wasn't just a goodbye. It was a mirror, showing me I could feel, choose, even mess up, and still stand. I smiled, small and shaky, because for once I wasn't numb. And that was worth it. This is an artistic and fictional creation intended for both entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or events is purely coincidental. Some scenes and dialogues in the video are part of a dramatized performance and incorporate elements of grotesque, satire, and exaggeration. The creator stands against discrimination, violence, and hatred. This channel fully complies with YouTube's policies and does not infringe upon copyright laws.